Welcome back. You're watching part 3 of a 4-part series where I take a look at the pre-release builds of Halo Combat Evolved. And for this video, I'm going to focus on the game's development throughout the year of 2000. The public saw gameplay of this build through the E3 trailer, a Wazzzup video which was a parody of a Budweiser commercial, and in an ad for an NVIDIA GeForce 2 GTS graphics card. Just over a month after Bungie showed off their E3 trailer, Microsoft acquired Bungie. This acquisition will have a big impact on the game's development. Bungie's no longer developing a game to be played on a computer, but rather Microsoft's new and upcoming video game console, the Xbox. Designing the game for the Xbox rather than a computer caused some big design changes, such as the change from third person to first person. In an interview with Vice, Halo's prototype designer, Lehto, states, "In order to actually feel like you were firing a gun, to have that connection now that you had a controller in your hand, it had to be first person. It felt too distant and separated in third person. We wanted to truly connect to the character, to the world you were exploring." It really was Jason's insistence around that same time that we be more connected to the players themselves, and going first person was the best way to achieve that. Now that you have some background of what's all going on during the game's development, let's take a look at this build. Starting with the characters, let's take a look at Master Chief. You can see he's gone through quite another visual overhaul, with his latest design bringing him one step closer to looking like the final design. You will notice that his armor does sport an antenna on the back, which is not in the final design. His visor also goes through some changes as Bungie develops this build. Sometimes it has more of a matte finish, while other times it looks more reflective. And the few times we do see him with that reflective visor, he doesn't have his antenna, which may indicate that the reflective visor was something added later in the development. Not only did his looks change, but his voice as well. Here's what his voice sounded like throughout different media during this point in development.
The drop zone is clear. I repeat, the drop zone is clear.
For 8 textures at full speed.
Not to mention cubic environment mapping.
Now that's one mean piece.
Hold on. Hello?
The last thing I want to note with Master Chief is that he does have his energy shield in this build. You can briefly see it in the E3 trailer when he gets shot by the Red Elite, which, as you can see here, isn't visually like the one that would ship with the game. This build would also show us our first look at the Marines. This wouldn't be Bungie's final design. Bungie would continue to tweak this design between now and release, by changing the color of their clothes, the design of their armor, as well as the color of the tactical eyepiece that some Marines wear. When it comes to the Elite's new design, they're almost unrecognizable from their old design. Though they look very similar to the final product, there is a few differences I did spot. Sometimes when they talk, the bottom 2 mandibles of their mouth don't separate. And this can be seen on a number of occasions, both in the GeForce commercial, as well as the E3 trailer. And while we're on the topic of Elites talking, let's give a listen to how they sound in this build. The E3 trailer also shows us a Red Elite who can speak English.
Your destruction is the will of the gods, and we are their instrument.
I'm not sure why the Red Elite talks English, why the others don't. Maybe it had something to do with the direction of the story at the time, but your guess is as good as mine. And one last detail I want to note with the Red Elite is that he appears to have some Forerunner symbols on the back of his armor. And the last thing I want to point out with the Elites is that they may or may not have an energy shield. It's really tough to tell. If you look really closely, you can see what appears to be an energy shield breaking on the Elite. It's definitely not as obvious as it is with Master Chief's shield. And if we take a look at the Grunt, there's a very subtle difference between this model and the one we'd get at release. You can clearly see the Grunt symbol is located on the right side of the Grunt's armor, but on release they switched it over to the Grunt's left hand side. Now when it comes to the Hunter, they made some interesting changes. Its armor and shield look almost rusted, with a bit of orange coloring to it. You'll also notice in the early model that the Hunter doesn't have a gun in his hand, which is something you really don't see in the game. And that'll do it for the enemies in this build, but what about the weapons? Let's take a look, starting with the assault rifle. When you look at the model in this build compared to the last build, you'll see that not much has changed, with the exception of the shape of the grip on the gun. Let's take a quick look and see how it fires in-game.
That did it. Pull back!
Judging by that gameplay, it sounds like the gun would sound different depending on how close or far you were away from the gun. And although I couldn't find any gameplay from this build of the grenade launcher being fired from the assault rifle, it may still be in this build. I'm basing that on the fact that the grenade ammo counter is still present in this build's HUD. In a October 2000 Halo Weekly update, Bungie's Matt Soul wrote, "Rob showed me one of the guns he's working on and it looks absolutely gorgeous, right down to the scratches on the barrel. And he wants the readout of the gun to be just as detailed, with a working compass and a screensaver animation when the player idles too long. Though I must remind you that this is not a perfect world, and we don't always get around to everything we want to do." So judging by the sound of it, it looks like the assault rifle may have gotten a screensaver, had there been enough time in development to make it. Now let's take a look at the sniper rifle. When you compare it to the design of the last build, it appears to be completely redesigned. The scope no longer glows red, it doesn't have that wooden finish, and there's a big gap between the stock and the rest of the gun. We also get a chance to see it fired in the E3 trailer.
Recon reporting. Hostiles have been neutralized.
We also get a glimpse of some first-person gameplay of the sniper. As you can see, it doesn't have a first-person model, but it does appear to have different magnifications when it comes to scoping. If you look over in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see that the gun does use the old shovel sniper icon, which could mean that this sniper is a redesign of the shovel sniper, or that the shovel sniper still exists in this build. The shotgun, like the sniper, got a visual overhaul. Not only that, it continued to get visually tweaked during the development of this build. And although Bungie redesigned the visual features of the shotgun, they did keep the functioning flashlight feature that we saw in the last build, which they showed off in a video commercial, E3 trailer, and some promotional screenshots. And we also get a very quick glimpse of it being fired in first person. And just like the sniper, the HUD icon uses the old design. It's also worth noting that it takes out the Red Elite in one shot. The SMG also makes an appearance in one of the screenshots for this build. This picture also has a Marine that's holding a new type of pistol. I say it's a new type because I don't think it's a redesign of the old one we saw earlier. In fact, the one from the older build looks a lot more like the one we got in the final release than the one we're looking at in this build. The scope's also not exactly the same as the sniper in this build. It appears to be lacking some of the detail on the front of the scope that the sniper has. We get a good look at the frag grenade in this build, and surprisingly there is a few differences. I'll show you the clip first, then I'll break down what those differences are.
Hey, Stooges.
Here's the model from the 2000 build on the left, and the finished model we got on the right. You can see there's a difference between the shade of green used for the grenade. In the 2000 build, it'll begin beeping, and this light begins to start blinking green. Whereas in the release version, it doesn't beep, and it only glows white. The 2000 model also has a red switch on the top of it, which isn't present in the release version. If we take a look at the Covenant weapons, starting with the plasma rifle, you'll see that the right side of the gun has these green lights that aren't in the final build. And in case you're wondering, here's what it sounds like while being fired. Looking at the needler, the base of the gun almost looks like a whitish color, whereas in retail it looks more like a dark purple. You'll also notice that the barrel of the gun is a lighter shade of blue. And lastly, the needles also emit light. And here's what they look like after striking a Marine. The speed of the projectiles is much faster than retail. The needles don't have purple explosions, and they don't appear to super combine either. And once again, visually speaking at least, the sword doesn't look all that different from its final release. But it does look like it behaves a bit differently though. Both times in gameplay we see it being used to stab instead of slash, and each time it does kind of a flicker effect when it pierces somebody, which can be seen here and here. Based on what we see in the E3 gameplay, sword-wielding elites would have also used a handheld shield to protect themselves. Unlike the portable shields found in the final product, this shield could be broken with assault rifle fire. There's also a cut covenant weapon in this build. We see it in the Wazzzup video, and also in a promotional screenshot. It really doesn't look much like any of the weapons we've seen in previous builds. It also looks like it went through a color change between the time of these two screenshots. That'll be a wrap for the weapons in this build. Now let's take a look at the vehicles, starting with the Warthog. We see two variants of the Warthog in this build. The first one I want to take a look at is the rocket variant. With this version of the Warthog, the gunner would have been well protected, hiding behind the big shield attached to the gun. Here's a look at it being fired. And as you just saw there, similar to the grenades, this thing's explosions are big. One feature that you can see in this build that didn't make it into the final game is that you can see where the gunner is aiming while you're driving the Warthog because the reticle is visible. Even when the gunner is aiming off screen from the driver's point of view, you can still see the reticle's tail, which would have gave you a better idea, as a driver, where the gunner is aiming. It looks like the physics of either the Warthog or the land isn't quite done yet, because as you can see here, the Warthog clips right through a rock. The other Warthog variant that can be found in this build is a machine gun variant, which can be seen in an NVIDIA commercial,
Graphics hardware. Now that we're waging an epic guerrilla war, NVIDIA's GeForce 2 GTS and Bungie's Halo. This is the future of gaming!
as well as in the background of a few of the promotional screenshots. And just like the other Warthog variant, it appears to have a really big shield, which I'm guessing got changed since it would have been hard to hit the gunner had it been facing in your direction. During the development of this build, the color of the Pelican's windshield changes color. You can see in this screenshot, as well as the NVIDIA commercial, the windshield has a bit of an orange color to it. Whereas in the E3 trailer, the windshield's tinted black. In one of the promotional screenshots, it's also shown having a gun attached to the bottom of it. Between this build and the final release, the inside of the Pelican got a visual upgrade. And once again, the Ghost makes another appearance, with no major changes to note. On the other hand, there's the Banshee, which does have a few things to note. The back fins will actually turn as you steer the Banshee. It also appears to destroy a Ghost in very few shots of its plasma cannon. Though it's quite possible that this was just staged for the E3 trailer. You'll notice that the Wraith has a similar characteristic as the Elites, in that where it gets shot, there's a blue effect where it takes damage. Another difference I noticed between this build and release is just how long the tail is on the Wraith's shot. It's not nearly this long in release, and it kind of reminds me of the plasma cannon from the last build. And for the last vehicle, well, this one didn't make it into the game. This Covenant vehicle was intended to be called the Shadow. It looks like it would have functioned similar to a Warthog, by having seats for a driver, a passenger, and a gunner. After the game would release, Bungie would reminisce on this vehicle in a 2004 The Origin of Halo post, which read, "The Shadow was one of the coolest looking vehicles left unused. Way back in the day, back when Halo was basically an RTS, the selection of vehicles was pretty huge. Hummers, which became Warthogs ostensibly, and stealth tanks, basically a low, black Scorpion, were about the most normal. A selection of cool looking alien and human tanks, and hovering death machines was lost in history. This writer's personal favorite? The bright red and pretty intimidating Covenant Shadow, complete with roof-mounted turret gun." Though the Shadow wouldn't make it into Combat Evolved, Bungie would go on to reuse the name Shadow for a different vehicle, which was introduced in Halo 2. I'd like to think that this vehicle was used as a base design for what would become the Spectre in Halo 2. With the vehicles being covered, let's take a look at the wildlife in this build. Once again, we see the blind wolves, which unfortunately will be the last time we see them in this game. Unlike the last video, we actually get to see the Thorn Beast in action. This creature shows up in the E3 trailer, promotional screenshots, and briefly in the Wazzzup video. And the last cut creature I want to talk about, you may be familiar with, and that's because it made its way into future Halo games. That creature I'm talking about would be the Huragok. or what it also would be known as, an engineer. Now we won't see the engineer anymore in future builds, but he was likely cut late in the game's development, since he shows up a number of times in the official Prima strategy guidebook. That, along with the fact that he's actually still in the game's code, and can even be brought out with the use of mods. And before I wrap up the video on this build, there's just a few things I want to touch on. An August 2000 article published by PC Gamer had the screenshot with the caption, "Not only will Halo feature indigenous life forms, but it will have a full weather system as well." I can't help but to wonder if this is the same dynamic weather feature that I covered in the last video. Another thing worth mentioning is some of the emotes that we saw in the previous build are still present in this build. And the final thing I want to draw attention to comes from a GameStar article published in May of 2000, which reads, "The laws of physics apply to water as well. Ejected cases float slowly in the tides. Some weapons only make a sad blub because they simply don't work in wet surroundings." I just wanted to point this last bit of information out, since it adds to the idea that underwater gameplay was planned for the game, which I touched on in the last video. And that'll cover this build. Check out part 4 where I take a look at the 2001 builds of Halo Combat Evolved. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.